Hello, and welcome to the summary of The Master and His Emissary, a book by Iain McGilchrist, which talks about the differences in perception and interpretation of information, which characterize the two different hemispheres of the brain, i.e. the right and the left hemisphere. As an important first note, there is no such thing as a left brain science, right brain art sort of dichotomy. McGilchrist's book holds no simplistic views of the brain, and the pop psychology notion that somehow if you're good at math, then you are a left brain dominant person and will be inferior as an illustrator to someone who is a right brain dominant person. This is just silly. It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't hold the weight of the scientific data. And in addition to this necessary rejection of many preconceived notions about the two halves of the brain, Dr. McGilchrist acknowledges that nearly every task the brain performs engages both hemispheres of the brain in one way or another. That being said, small differences in the way that mental tasks are divided and performed between the hemispheres tend to compound and form a more or less coherent image of two separate and interconnected subunits of the brain. This in tandem with split brain patients, people who have had their corpus callosum actually severed, creating two completely independent hemispheres of the brain, also back this because they tend to exhibit different personalities and wills within the two different hemispheres. Also, people who have had an entire hemisphere removed can still have a fully functioning life, indicating that one hemisphere on its own contains the necessary requisite packages, so to speak, neural packages that are necessary for life itself and consciousness to keep going. So McGilchrist goes as far as arguing that each hemisphere has its own will and will project that will onto human culture and the external world, an assertion that seems far-fetched at the outset, but makes quite a lot of sense by the end of the book. Understand that this book is incredibly nuanced and filled to the brim with supporting data, so no assertion is made in a vacuum. A major reason for this summary is that The Master and His Emissary is incredibly dense, full of scientific and philosophical jargon that can easily ensnare the layperson in details and confusion at the expense of the bigger picture. It is a work of absolute genius, and it is easy to fall into the trap that it would take a genius to understand what Iain McGilchrist is talking about. That being said, The Master and His Emissary is full to the brim with useful information that translates to nearly every conceivable aspect of life. I feel compelled to hopefully make the ideas in this book more readily available to a wider audience, because I personally think about this book every day as one of my primary ways of interpreting life's complexities, from spiritual aspects of life to current events. I too am a layperson. I'm not a neuroscientist or a psychologist by training. That being said, I do have a moderate understanding of biology, philosophy, and human anatomy, which hopefully gives some value to my words. I have a degree in genetics, and I read many books about philosophy and biology in my spare time, including this book, which I have read 3 times. And I learn something new every time. It's one of those books where every time I finish it, I can't believe that it actually exists. It's such an incredible book. So if all goes according to plan, hopefully I can convey a slice of Dr. McGilchrist's genius to the rest of us who don't know offhand what the temporal parietal junction is, or the difference between a gyrus and a sulcus in brain anatomy. Also, in order to keep from bogging down in details, this initial summary will include next to none of the sources Iain McGilchrist cites, except for those explicitly necessary to understand the gist of the book. I will dissect the book over time. That is something I want to do, and I will include the citations as I go through bit by bit. But in the interest of time and understanding, the summary will be necessarily fast and shallow. With those caveats and explanations out of the way, let's start with the name of the book itself. The title, The Master and His Emissary, refers to a fable that McGilchrist credits to Nietzsche, but it's of ambiguous origin where it actually came from. But the story is, a wise master of a large kingdom sends out his emissary to do his bidding in the far-flung reaches of his holdings. He trusts the emissary to do his will, so that the master has the necessary distance from the mundane aspects of life to contemplate and solve the problems faced by the people as a whole. However, the emissary thinks that he is the one doing all the work and does not appreciate the wisdom of the master. He feels dejected and underappreciated, and this leads the emissary to usurp the master and lead him off in chains, taking up the role as master of the realm. However, because the emissary was never meant to be the master, he was not as wise as the master and cannot do what the master does. The kingdom naturally falls into disarray and disintegrates. Fundamentally, the master would have a difficult time getting on without the emissary, but the emissary, by contrast, is unable to do at all what the master does. There's an imbalance of power there, an influence, where again, the master has a hard time without the emissary, but the emissary and the kingdom itself cannot live without the master. And without the master, the entire society collapses under complexities that the emissary did not understand. So Dr. McGilchrist includes this fable as a metaphorical description of the relationship between the right and left hemisphere. Within the confines of this metaphor, the right hemisphere is the master and the left hemisphere is the usurping emissary. Another metaphor that works in this regard is that of Prometheus, where the gods on Mount Olympus represent the intuitions and wisdom of the right hemisphere, and Prometheus is the usurping left hemisphere, bringing information and knowledge down to humans, thinking that he is wise to do so in the form of fire, all the while unleashing undesired consequences for him and for the humans that he so desired to serve. This does not mean that the left hemisphere is essentially evil. Quite the contrary, it is completely necessary to integrate the worldviews produced by each hemisphere in order to attain a fulfilled life. The problem is that while the right hemisphere understands the interconnectedness of all things and tends naturally towards a sort of melancholy humility that no one can truly know everything, the left hemisphere is hubristic and thinks that first off it can know everything, and second, it tends to think that it already knows everything useful to its own aims, which are primarily the exercise of power to manipulate the external world, to acquire valuable physical objects, and influence over other people. Now, why did the two hemispheres of the brain come to exist in the first place? Why has evolution produced brain asymmetries in nearly all vertebrates? Why or what advantages does having a split brain give in contrast with having one unitary brain? Fundamentally, there are two aspects of being that are always in opposition with one another. Jordan Peterson calls these aspects chaos and order, which is an apt description. Within this framework, the right hemisphere contends with chaos, bringing new aspects of the infinitely complex world into our field of perception, and the left hemisphere deconstructs the scene brought to it by the right hemisphere into usable bits of information, wresting order out of chaotic sense data. The way in which attention is given to the world, Dr. McGilchrist's word, the howness of attention, as in how versus what, differs between the hemispheres. The right hemisphere gives a broad spectrum global attention to the world, whereas the left hemisphere gives a powerful but narrow attention to what is perceived as immediately useful. In fact, some medical patients with right hemisphere deficits, resulting in left hemisphere overcompensation, have what is known as forced utilization behavior, where if they see something of known utility, they have to use it. For example, if someone with forced utilization behavior passes a doorknob, they have to turn the doorknob and open the door. Then often they have a sort of sticky attention that doesn't disengage easily without outside intervention. They'll stand at the door with their hand on the knob, waiting for someone to come and intervene. This provides a window into the object-oriented, short-sighted world of the left hemisphere. This underlines part of the reason why the left hemisphere is prone to hubris. It does not interact directly with the world as it is, but rather only with the world as it sees it, with the abstractions that it already knows about the world. The left hemisphere is primed for the understanding and manipulation of facts and items, not the apprehension of the ultimate unity and individuality of all things, which is the mode of the right hemisphere. Paradox is a good example of this, where the left hemisphere sees what would be classified as a paradox, any paradox, The right hemisphere doesn't see each ends of that spectrum as a dichotomy, but rather sees them as two halves of one unity. For example, the faith and works whole argument in theology, that you are either saved by faith alone or you are saved by your works alone. To the right hemisphere, this isn't an argument at all. It's both at the same time, all the time, whereas the left hemisphere tends to say either or. So put in terms of an analogy, the left hemisphere sees a world of Legos that can be deconstructed and rearranged, whereas the right hemisphere sees everything all at once, like a picture coming into focus. One understands the world in terms of bits that can be rearranged at will, whereas the other understands the gestalt of a situation summarized as an aha moment. Reiterated, the right hemisphere's fundamental aim is connection and relatedness, viewing the world for what it is as it comes into being over time, whereas the left hemisphere's purpose is to utilize aspects of the world and manipulate the world's constituent parts to create products and tools which help it acquire items and status in the world. The right hemisphere is fundamentally relational, whereas the left hemisphere is fundamentally competitive. Obviously, it is important to acquire things and survive in the world, which is part of the reason why the left hemisphere came into being at all, as it is. But, like the relationship of the Master to his emissary, a life dedicated to acquiring symbols of power, divorced from a sense of depth and interconnectedness with the world and other people, can never generate the sustaining meaning that is necessary for a life well lived. Unless you're a sociopath, I suppose, but they also have documented right hemisphere deficits and left hemisphere overcompensation, which is quite interesting. The left hemisphere has a tendency to think that it is right above all else, and values internal rational coherency above what one might consider reason and common sense, both of which are right hemisphere mediated ways of understanding through intuition. This fits well with the division of the left and right hemispheres as abstract left, context-based right, as rational arguments can be constructed out of disparate and incongruous pieces of information, but then can be made to sound as if they create a unified whole through rhetoric. Just as an off-the-cuff example, I don't remember what the example is in the book, so this is an approximation. Medical patients with right hemisphere deficits and a left hemisphere overdominance would hear the following syllogism and be unable to understand why it is not correct. Dogs have hair. My brother has hair. Therefore, my brother is a dog. A sacrifice of context, which would be the other aspects of what differentiates a dog from a human, down to the immediate focus of whether or not the thing in question has hair, leads the rational left hemisphere to make a false conclusion that my brother is indeed a dog. Interestingly enough, the left hemisphere tends to become irate and angry when its rational arguments are questioned. Since the proud left hemisphere tends to think it already knows everything worth knowing, it does not like to have its expertise brought into question. This may explain why people who simultaneously know very little about a topic but have strong opinions formed about the issue become increasingly frustrated when their stance is challenged, as they do not have the understanding necessary to realize how complex the topic truly is, and jump to conclusions that may be substantiated by a bizarre form of internal logic, but which do not hold up to the light of reason and empirical data. The left hemisphere also contains what is called Broca's area, the region of the left frontal lobe responsible for explicit speech and logic. This puts the imagistic right hemisphere at a disadvantage when it comes to dealing with the left hemisphere's rebellious nature. Not only does the left hemisphere not have access to explicit descriptive speech, what one might call prose versus poetry, which the right hemisphere can create, it also recognizes that internal rationality is not the ultimate marker of correctness, just one buttressing aspect of it. The left hemisphere sees this as weakness and foolhardiness, something mirrored today onto society's rejection of anything that cannot be rationally proven, such as the existence of God. The left hemisphere prizes knowledge and information, whereas the right hemisphere loves wisdom, especially the embodied nature of wisdom. Empathy arises from the right hemisphere, and it recognizes the soul's need for what the left hemisphere so often characterizes as the mundane or superfluous, wildness in nature, unstructured play with no practical goals, the repetitive nature of daily tasks, and even the body itself. In essence, the different modes of attention given to the world by the two hemispheres can be apprehended by the two different Spanish translations of the English verb to know. As any former Spanish 1 student will know, saber and conocer are two different concepts. Saber refers to knowledge of facts, information abstracted out of the context of the world, or book learning. Conocer, on the other hand, refers to the knowing of a person, place, or aspect of being, a kind of embodied knowledge that you cannot acquire outside of personally witnessing the uniqueness of the subject at hand. For example, I know, as in saber, that LeBron James is 6'9", but I do not know him personally, as in conocer. I could troll Google for articles about LeBron's athletic achievements, his net worth, his opinions on current events, and even get a picture of what his character is like as a person, but I would still not know him in the conocer sense. The uniqueness of LeBron James as a person, just like any other person and really any other observable object, can only be understood through personal contact through the embodied self. Calling back to the fable of the Master and His Emissary, knowing the physical characteristics of a person, left hemisphere emissary, is indeed useful information, but without the knowledge and understanding that comes from actual personal contact, right hemisphere master, a relationship cannot be formed. Applied in a general sense, relying too heavily on the left hemisphere worldview, without reintegration back into the embodied self of the right hemisphere, results in a life full of information but lacking in substance, a relationship with the world founded on dead abstractions and deficient in lived experience. This is hardly a life worth living, as described, and it is the kind of life we see playing itself out all over the industrialized world. An ever-growing world population finds itself in better economic conditions than any other time in human history, with infinite access to knowledge and potential connection to new people around the globe, and yet the stereotypical modern person is dissatisfied, irritable, prone to ideological possession, depressed, anxious, and most of all, as we see by Bowling Alone by Robert Putnam, alone. We as a society are trying to solve spiritual problems with materialistic means, and if we stand a chance against the growing trends towards totalitarianism around the world, we need to return to the world of the right hemisphere, a world of connection, embodied wisdom, and humility in the face of the endless complexity of the world around us. This is by its very nature a crude summary, since the book The Master and His Emissary is so enormous and full of citations. The notes and bibliography just in and of themselves are over 100 pages, and the text is comically small. You need a microscope to read it. So I cannot go into the detailed evidence that Dr. McGilchrist so carefully lays out over the course of this book in this overview. I want to over time again, but I need a point of reference to build off of moving forward, and this summary has to serve that purpose. Even though it's rough, I hope the summary is good enough to give you a taste of what the book is about, and from here we can build out a better understanding of the hemisphere differences and how they translate into real-world applications, such as the consistent advance of technological prowess at the expense of both personal meaning and our social fabric, and the absurd closed-minded nature of modern political discourse. In a large way, I believe that the critical social justice movement is a left hemisphere attempt to hijack right hemisphere aspects of empathy and interconnectedness that many politically left-leaning people feel is lacking in society. The various critical theories use a distinctly left hemisphere approach of stripping people down to their constituent aspects, race, gender, economic class, etc., and claim that this is the only viable means of analysis. The self-referential worldview of contemporary social theories, see all social structures as expression of power, left hemisphere. This power structure is maintained through the control of what is considered good or normative through a stranglehold on language and social convention by the dominant class. Also a left hemisphere view on the world. If we see a society, if we as a society could only break down the fill in the blank, racist, homophobic, transphobic, classist, etc., structures of oppression by speaking into being a new society, even a new reality, an expression of the value given to explicit language by the left hemisphere, then we could finally be liberated individuals and usher in the perfect world. The problem with this critical view of the world, critical as in critical theory, is not that it identifies problems with our existing social order. The world is not static, and because the world itself is always in flux, our social structures need to be flexible enough to change when issues are identified. The problem with critical view of the world is that it exhibits all the worst flaws inherent in the left hemisphere view of the world, hubris that its social theories are always correct, a sacrifice of the complex nature of life and history down to a narrow band of acceptable interpretations, an emphasis on the power of explicit language, which inevitably leads to censorship of unacceptable speech, and the desire to bend the existing language to serve an ideological purpose. Think of definition changing, asserting as fact that all human relations are laced with implicit power struggles, and that the only way to solve the eternal problem of inequities in power is to give the critical theorists ultimate control. Hopefully this gives a sense of why I think The Master and His Emissary is such an important book for understanding human behavior. Obviously, critical theory is not the only social issue that this book applies to. So if you want to read or listen to the book yourself, I highly encourage you to do so. It's very useful information to know. It's very meaningful. It adds richness to life. And the best advice I can give is to let yourself understand. Don't force the experience. Don't let yourself become ensnared on facts or details you don't fully understand. Keep reading and let your understanding build with time and repeated effort. I promise that you do not need to memorize the anatomy and physiology of the brain to gain deep and meaningful insights from this book. If you've enjoyed this summary and you want to hear more of my future work tying The Master and His Emissary to various topics, including critical social justice, the advance of AI and mechanization on human life, and even Mormon theology and doctrine, then consider subscribing to the channel and liking the video. Leave a comment with any thoughts or questions you may have while listening through this summary, and I'll do my best to address them. Thanks for listening. Hope you have a great day, and until next time.